Be made to understand from the start that Mr. Lincoln is the president in fact as well as in name. To control the meddlesome, headstrong, mercurial Secretary of State was a Herculean task for the president. 8 years Seward's junior, and far less politically experienced. Seward naively thought that Southern disaffection could be overcome by clever intrigue, and he optimistically declared that the Deep South will be unable to exist for long as a separate confederation and will return to the Union sooner or later. He remarked insouciantly that he and all his brothers and sisters seceded from home in early life, but they all returned. So would the states. The fateful decision to relieve Fort Sumter. The day after the inauguration, Lincoln was astounded not only by news that Major Anderson had a mere 6 weeks' worth of supplies, but also by a letter from General Scott, stating that Anderson and his fellow officers believed that they must either surrender or be overrun. Scott recommended that the garrison be evacuated. The obese, vain, aged general was retreating from his hardline position of October, when he had urged the reinforcement of forts throughout the South, including those in Charleston Harbor. On March 3rd, he had written to Seward suggesting that it would be unwise, if not actually impossible, to subdue the South militarily, and that it might be best for Lincoln either to endorse the Crittenden Compromise or else tell the Cotton States, "Wayward sisters, depart in peace." Scott's unsettling about-face was effected by Seward, who exercised great influence over the general. All winter long, the senator had assiduously cultivated him. Montgomery Blair thought that Scott had fallen into Mr. Charles Francis Adams' error in regarding Mr. Seward as the head of the government, and for this reason surrendered his own better judgment to that of Mr. Seward. On March 6th, at Lincoln's request, Scott briefed Wells, Cameron, Seward, and other officials, who were dumbfounded when the general reiterated what he had written to the president. Wells and Cameron urged that the administration take immediate and efficient measures to relieve and reinforce the garrison. Scott did not express an opinion, but pointed out that an earlier attempt to provision the fort had failed. He added that since Major Anderson had shifted his base from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, the South Carolinians had surrounded the latter with formidable batteries and were preparing an attack. Scott acknowledged, however, that the question was one for naval authorities to decide. The following day, Lincoln again met with this small group for an informal discussion. Scott and his chief engineer, Joseph G. Taunton, agreed that it would be impracticable to reinforce Sumter. Wells and his adviser, Captain Silas Stringham, insisted that the Navy could do so. The skeptical Seward offered many suggestions and raised several questions, but no conclusions were reached. On March 9th, the full cabinet convened to hear some unsettling news. "I was astonished to be informed that Fort Sumter must be evacuated," Bates confided to his diary. That same day, Lincoln asked Scott how long Sumter could hold out, whether he could supply or reinforce the garrison within that time frame, and what additional means might be needed to accomplish that goal if present means were insufficient. He asked the general to put his answers in writing and to exercise all possible vigilance for the maintenance of all the places within the military department of the United States, and to promptly call upon all the departments of the government for the means necessary to that end. Incredibly, Scott ignored that directive. Instead, he simply replied that to save Sumter, he would need a large fleet, 25,000 more troops, and several months to train them. As a practical military question, he said, the time for succoring Fort Sumter, with any means at hand, had passed away nearly a month ago. Since then, a surrender under assault or from starvation has been merely a question of time. On March 11th, Scott drafted an order instructing Anderson to evacuate the fort. Lincoln gave serious thought to issuing that order.